Security logs could not explain the face seen in this stairwell. Shortly after 2 one winter morning in downtown Spokane, a security camera recorded a face where no person should have been standing. The camera captured only 11 seconds, yet those seconds created a problem that building staff never managed to resolve. By sunrise, the stairwell was empty, the access doors were locked, and every electronic entry record appeared completely normal. Elise Moran was 34, a night security supervisor who worked alone during the quietest hours inside a 6-story medical office building. She had taken the shift because it paid more, and she was saving money before moving closer to her aging parents. Most nights involved checking alarms, watching empty hallways, and documenting contractors who entered through the rear loading area after business hours. Nothing in her 3 years there had prepared her for what appeared on camera 14 that January morning. The camera covered a concrete stairwell connecting the parking garage with offices on the 2nd through 6th floors. Its view showed 2 landings, a steel handrail, and a fire door that required an electronic badge from either direction. Elise understood those records well because reviewing them was part of her job whenever doors opened after midnight. At 13 minutes past 2, Elise noticed the stairwell feed briefly darken as if someone had passed close beneath the camera. She checked the adjacent hallway feed and saw no movement outside the fire door on the 4th floor. 3 minutes later, the image stabilized and a pale face appeared between 2 vertical sections of railing near the lower landing. The face remained motionless while the body belonging to it stayed completely hidden below the camera's visible angle. Elise first assumed a patient or contractor had entered through the garage and stopped on the stairs to use a phone. She enlarged the feed and saw no phone, reflective vest, badge cord, or movement that might identify the person. The face seemed angled upward toward the camera, though compression noise made its eyes difficult to interpret with confidence. What concerned her most was that the access software showed no door opening anywhere near that stairwell. She radioed Daniel Price, a 29-year-old maintenance technician who was replacing damaged ceiling panels on the building's 5th floor. Daniel had accepted the overnight assignment because daytime repairs would have disrupted several clinics operating inside the building. He reached the 4th floor stairwell door less than 2 minutes later and waited while Elise watched his badge register correctly. The system showed Daniel entering at 21 minutes past 2, which meant the same system should have recorded whoever appeared 8 minutes earlier. Daniel descended slowly while keeping Elise on the radio, and she watched his movement cross the same camera without interruption. He found nobody on the 4th floor landing, nobody below it, and no sign that any fire door had been forced. The concrete steps were dry despite light snow outside, and no wet footprints marked the painted floor near the garage level. Daniel reportedly checked every landing twice before returning upstairs and telling Elise that the stairwell was completely empty. Elise saved the clip and reviewed the earlier footage frame by frame during the remaining hours of her shift. The face first appeared gradually, almost as though someone had risen from below the railing without bringing their shoulders into view. It remained visible for 11 seconds before the picture broke into gray blocks and returned to an empty landing. Archive notes later showed that the camera had experienced compression errors before, although none involved a recognizable human face. The building manager arrived shortly after 7 and asked Elise to prepare a written incident report before leaving. He checked the badge database, garage records, elevator activity, and alarm panel for the periods surrounding the footage. Dispatch logs from the contracted security company contained no calls from that stairwell and no alarms elsewhere inside the property. Records conflict only on one detail, because the camera clock appeared 4 seconds slower than the access control server. That difference seemed minor, but it became important when the company contacted the camera vendor later that afternoon. A support technician explained that the video system buffered images locally before sending them to the main recorder. Under heavy network traffic, a saved clip could contain several seconds from an earlier moment while displaying the current timestamp. That explanation offered a possible technical cause, but investigators never confirmed where the face would have been recorded originally. The building hired Marcus Bell, a 42-year-old private investigator who specialized in workplace theft and access control disputes. Marcus was asked to determine whether someone had entered without authorization or whether the clip resulted from a system fault. He interviewed Elise and Daniel separately, then compared their statements against state records for licensed contractors assigned to the property. No listed worker matched the person visible in the stairwell, although the image quality prevented any reliable facial identification. Marcus also requested raw footage from cameras near the parking garage, loading dock, lobby, and fourth-floor corridor. Those recordings showed only 3 people inside during the relevant period, including Elise, Daniel, and a janitor working 2 floors away. No camera captured an unknown person arriving or leaving, which made a simple, unauthorized entry difficult to demonstrate. One theory focused on the emergency release mechanism installed beside the garage door at the lowest stairwell level. During a power failure, that door could unlock mechanically without creating the same electronic record as a normal badge entry. Maintenance records showed that technicians had tested the mechanism 2 weeks earlier after a battery warning appeared on the alarm panel. However, no outage occurred that night, and the release unit showed no fault when Daniel inspected it the next morning. Another possibility involved video reflection from the polished metal plate mounted behind the camera housing near the upper landing. Marcus photographed the angle and asked a technician to recreate the scene with Daniel standing several steps below view. Under certain lighting conditions, part of Daniel's face could reflect into the camera lens as a faint overlapping image. Some locals claimed the building had a history of unexplained sightings because an older hospital once occupied part of the same downtown block. Marcus found no evidence supporting the stories beyond comments posted online after the incident became known among several employees. A county file from 2009 described renovations and code violations, but it contained nothing involving disappearances or suspicious deaths. He excluded those rumors from his report because they could not explain a camera image or missing access event. The most practical explanation emerged when Marcus examined how the recorder handled corrupted frames during brief network interruptions. If packets arrived out of sequence, the software could preserve fragments from separate moments before rebuilding a damaged image. A face recorded earlier on another camera might theoretically appear for several frames if cache data were assigned incorrectly during recovery. The manufacturer acknowledged that corrupted images were possible, but denied that its system could combine recognizable content from separate camera channels. Elise remained interested in one detail that the technical reports treated as unimportant compared with the larger timestamp problem. Seconds before the face appeared, the fourth-floor fire door moved slightly inward despite the access log showing no badge use. Daniel later demonstrated that pressure changes from the ventilation system could move the door less than an inch when another door opened below. Yet, the garage feed showed no door movement at that exact time, leaving the source of the pressure change uncertain. Marcus completed his report 3 weeks later and listed the incident as unresolved because neither intrusion nor equipment failure could be proven. His conclusion stated that the image probably resulted from a technical problem, but available testing did not reproduce the original event. The company replaced camera 14 and upgraded the access server before ending the investigation without a final explanation. For several months afterward, Elise continued working nights and checked the stairwell more often than her schedule required. No second face appeared, and the replacement camera produced no unusual recordings during the remainder of her time at the building. Daniel eventually returned to daytime maintenance, while Marcus kept a copy of the clip with other unresolved access cases. The footage never proved that anyone was inside the stairwell, but the records never proved that nobody was there either.
The stories. What happened inside this mountain lodge will shock you. The guest log from that mountain lodge still sits in a plastic evidence sleeve with one page glued to another. Dispatch records show a routine welfare check, then a second call minutes later that changed everything. In early October of 2011, Tegan Rourke was 33 and worked as a county building inspector. That morning, Tegan planned to recheck a roof repair on a remote lodge above a winding forest road. The lodge stayed open year-round, but the owner only kept staff there on busy weekends. Tegan had done permits there before, and the place always felt quiet but harmless. The weather was clear, and the drive up took just under 2 hours from the county offices downtown. Tegan's county truck climbed through pine stands and bare rock, and the radio kept fading in and out. A printed work order sat on the passenger seat, with a note about leaks over the dining hall. Tegan expected a quick walkthrough, a few photos, and a signature from whoever was on site. At the turnoff, the lodge sign leaned slightly, and the gravel lot had only one vehicle parked. It was an older SUV with an out-of-state plate, and its driver window was cracked open. Tegan noted it in a small notebook because parked vehicles mattered in a rural inspection log. The lodge itself was a long timber building with a stone chimney and tall windows facing the slope. Tegan knocked at the front doors and waited, then tried again with a little more force. No one answered, and the doors were locked, which was unusual during posted open hours. Tegan walked around to the side entrance near the kitchen, where staff usually came and went. That door was also locked, but the deadbolt was not fully seated, like it had been rushed. Tegan called the owner's number from the permit file, and it went to voicemail after 4 rings. A text message sent, then stayed unread, and Tegan felt the first small pinch of worry. County rules allowed an exterior inspection without entry, but the leak note required a look inside. Tegan radioed the office, reported no contact, and said a second attempt would be made shortly. Tegan moved under the eaves and checked the roof line from the ground with binoculars. The shingles looked new over one section, and a gutter joint had been patched with sloppy sealant. A faint drip line stained the siding, and Tegan snapped photos with a work phone. Then a sound came from inside, a single thud that carried through the front windows. Tegan froze, listening, and heard nothing else for several seconds after that heavy impact. The lodge sat too far from neighbors for casual foot traffic, and no wind moved the doors. Tegan tried the front doors again, and this time the right door shifted a half-inch. It had been locked before, but now the latch gave slightly, like something inside pressed against it. Tegan stepped back and decided not to force entry, because welfare checks were not the county job. Still, the odd shift in the door made leaving feel wrong, like ignoring a smoke smell. Tegan called the sheriff dispatch line and requested a deputy to check the building. The call log later showed Tegan used calm language, but the dispatcher noted concern about possible injury. While waiting, Tegan walked back toward the SUV to see if someone was nearby in the lot. The SUV keys were not visible, and the seats were empty, but a paper map lay open on the dash. A small badge clip hung from the rearview mirror, the kind used for conferences or guided tours. Tegan could not read the name through the glass, but the plastic sleeve looked freshly printed. Tegan stood by the county truck and watched the lodge windows, expecting movement in the curtains. Nothing shifted, and the silence started to feel staged, like a room waiting for a cue. A second thud came, softer this time, followed by a faint scrape that lasted 2 seconds. Tegan raised the phone to record audio, then stopped, unsure if that would help later. Deputy Marlo Kincaid arrived about 20 minutes later, alone in a marked unit. Marlo was 41 and had worked patrol in the county for 14 years. He greeted Tegan, took in the locked lodge and the lone SUV, and asked what happened so far. Tegan explained the door shift and the sounds, then handed over the permit file contact number. Marlo tried the front entrance, found the same slight give, and tested the handle carefully. The door opened 2 inches, then stuck, as if something heavy pressed it from the other side. Marlo called out, "Sheriff's office! Anyone inside?" and waited for an answer that never came. He motioned Tegan to stay back, then reached around the gap with a flashlight. The beam caught a strip of carpet near the threshold, darkened by something that looked wet. Marlowe's posture changed, and he pushed the door harder, but it still would not swing fully. He stepped aside, drew a small pry bar from his kit, and worked the latch without splintering wood. The door gave another few inches, and the smell hit them both, sharp and sour like old water and metal. Marlowe backed out and called dispatch again, requesting a second unit and medical standby. The dispatch log reportedly shows his tone shifted from routine to urgent within that sentence. He then circled to the kitchen door, found it partially unseated, and eased it open with his shoulder. That entrance opened cleanly, and the two of them stepped into a dim hallway lined with framed photos. The lodge was colder inside than it should have been, like the heat had been off for hours. A small radio played faintly in the kitchen, but the volume was low, almost like it was meant to hide. Marlowe followed the sound toward the dining hall, moving slow and keeping Tegan behind him. The floorboards creaked, and a hanging light swayed slightly, though no air seemed to move. At the dining hall doorway, something blocked the opening from the far side. It was a chair tipped on its side, wedged against the door like a crude barricade. Marlowe pushed it away with his boot, and the doorway cleared enough to see the room. The tables were set for breakfast, but no food sat out, and the place looked paused mid-routine. Near the fireplace, a man lay on his back with one arm bent under him at an awkward angle. He wore a lodge, staff polo, and his face had bruising around one eye, older than a few minutes. Marlowe checked for response from a safe distance, then moved in and felt for a pulse. The man was cold, and Marlowe looked down at the floor beside him, where dried streaks ran toward the entry. Tegan stood in the doorway, trying not to stare, and focused on small details to stay steady. A lodge keyring lay near the man's hand, and one key was snapped clean in half. A thin line of clear fishing wire ran from the chair at the doorway to a table leg. It was tied tight, and Tegan saw it only because the flashlight glare caught its sheen. Marlowe followed the wire with his eyes, then cut it with a pocket knife to remove tension. He told Tegan to step back into the hallway, and Tegan did without arguing. He radioed dispatch again, and his short words suggested a deceased person and a possible scene. The radio response crackled, and for a moment, Tegan could not understand any of it through the static. While waiting for backup, Marlowe did a slow sweep without touching anything else. He checked the front entrance from inside and found the reason it would not open. A heavy rolling cart from the kitchen had been shoved against it, with towels stuffed under its wheels. The cart was positioned with care, like someone wanted the door to move just enough to tempt entry. The lodge office sat behind the front desk, and Marlowe could see light under its door. He tested the knob, found it locked, then noticed a second strand of wire at ankle height. That wire ran from the office door handle to a wall hook, like a tension trap. He stepped over it and stayed clear, then called out again to announce his presence. No one answered from the office, but a printer clicked once, then hummed as if waking. The sound was small, yet it made Tegan's stomach tighten, because it implied someone had been there. Marlowe kept his weapon holstered and used a mirror tool to look around the door edge. He saw no movement, then waited, like he was giving a hidden person time to make a choice. Backup arrived, along with a medic unit that stopped short when the scene was explained. Deputy Arden Sola joined Marlowe, and together they secured the lodge and kept Tegan outside. Tegan sat on a stone bench by the entrance, hands on knees, watching steam rise from their breath. From that spot, Tegan noticed something odd about the SUV. The rear hatch was not fully latched. When Arden checked the SUV, she did not open it right away, but photographed the gap first. Inside the hatch, a duffel bag sat open with folders, a portable recorder, and extra badge clips. The badges all carried the lodge name, with a line that read, Guest Services Volunteer Weekend. None of the badges had a photo, only a blank square and a printed first name that looked generic. Arden set the bag aside as possible evidence and closed the hatch gently, leaving it for investigators. Detectives arrived later that afternoon, and the lodge became a sealed scene with tape and logs. Tegan gave a formal statement, repeating details, and was asked twice about the fishing wire. Tegan described where it was tied and how it caught the flashlight glare, and the detective wrote carefully. They also asked about the earlier thuds, and Tegan admitted the second scrape sounded like furniture moving. The detectives found another staff member in an upstairs room, alive but disoriented and dehydrated. She was named Lorna Vess, 36, and worked as a front desk clerk during weekends. Lorna reportedly said she had been locked in the room and her phone had been taken. She remembered arguing with someone she thought was a guest, then a sting in her neck, then darkness. In the office, investigators found a laptop open to a guest reservation list. Several names were typed in, then deleted, then typed again, like someone kept changing the plan. A printed sheet sat in the printer tray, warm to the touch, listing check-in times for people who never arrived. The times were spaced exactly 15 minutes apart, and each entry used the same handwriting style in the notes field. They also recovered an audio recorder under the front desk, still running when it was found. The file timestamp matched the morning of the welfare check, according to later reports. It captured faint footsteps, the scrape of a cart, and a voice whispering a phrase twice. The phrase was hard to make out, but analysts later suggested it sounded like, "Keep them outside." Tegan was asked to review photos of the dining hall layout from earlier permit visits. Tegan noticed the tables were arranged differently than normal, leaving clear paths between doorways. The fireplace tools had been moved to the far wall, neatly lined up like they were counted. A single chair sat facing the front desk, centered, as if someone wanted a person to sit there. It was the kind of staging that looked normal until someone pointed out how deliberate it was. The dead man was identified as a seasonal employee hired 3 weeks earlier. His employment file listed only a local mailing address and a prepaid phone number. Investigators could not confirm prior work references, and the ID copy looked unusually clean. The medical examiner later ruled the death a homicide caused by blunt force trauma and delayed help. The report noted older bruises, suggesting the man had been struck earlier, then moved. Lorna, once stabilized, gave more details in a second interview that detectives treated as key. She recalled a guest who arrived the night before, claiming the lodge needed a safety inspection. He wore a lanyard badge that looked official, and he spoke with confident, practiced calm. He asked where the security cameras recorded and whether the front doors could be opened from inside. When Lorna questioned the request, he smiled and said, "It's a drill. The owner knows." That line sounded harmless in the moment, but it became important once detectives checked the owner's story. The owner insisted no drill was planned and no outside safety contractor had been hired. Phone records showed the owner received missed calls, but none were returned until late afternoon. He also admitted he rarely checked the lodge on weekdays, and he trusted staff to handle small issues. That gap in oversight gave someone space to run a plan without interruption. The biggest break came from the guest services volunteer badges found in the SUV. A detective called the lodge booking vendor and asked about the volunteer weekend program. The vendor said no such event existed, and the lodge had never used that wording in promotions. The badge design, however, matched a template used by a nearby conference center. It was a generic print layout, the kind anyone could buy online and customize in minutes. Investigators then pulled archived security footage from a gas station down the mountain. The footage reportedly showed the older SUV arriving the previous evening, then leaving briefly, then returning. A man in a ball cap carried a rolling cart cover, like the ones used for banquet linens. He moved with familiarity, like he knew exactly what tools he needed and where to place them. He also wore a lanyard, and the badge swung forward once, showing a blank square where a photo belonged. The twist did not come from a hidden identity reveal, but from a detail Tegan almost dismissed. During the first statement, Tegan mentioned the front door shifting, as if something pressed it. A detective later asked Tegan to walk through that moment again, step by step, without guessing. Tegan realized the door shift happened after the first thud, not before, which meant timing mattered. It suggested someone moved the cart to create the tempting gap only after hearing Tegan outside. That led detectives back to the audio recorder under the front desk. They enhanced the section between the thud and the door shift, filtering out the radio static. A clearer sound emerged, the rolling squeak of rubber wheels, followed by a breathy whisper. The phrase was not "keep them outside" after all, it was "get them outside," repeated with urgency. It sounded like a command to someone else, not a reminder to self. From there, the theory shifted in a way that surprised even the investigators on the case. They had assumed a lone intruder staged traps to prevent entry, then escaped out a back route. Instead, the evidence pointed to two people, one inside controlling access, another upstairs managing Lorna. The dead employee likely resisted, got injured, and became a problem to move out of sight. The person at the front desk then tried to lure an outsider in, but keep them from seeing too much. The chair barricade and fishing wire were not meant to harm an intruder. They were meant to slow them down, trip them lightly, and force them to look at the floor. If someone stumbled, they would focus on their footing, not on the office door or the front desk area. The rolling cart at the front door was positioned to let the latch click, making it seem unlocked. That tiny invitation would draw a person to the wrong entrance, while the real exit stayed clear elsewhere. A second exit did exist, but it was not a secret tunnel or anything dramatic. It was the service stairwell that led to a ground-level storage door behind the lodge. That door had no alarm contact, because it was listed as an interior-only access in old plans. Tegan's permit photos from years earlier showed the door, but no one had updated the security list. The person who planned this had likely studied those plans or worked a similar building before. In the weeks that followed, the case did not end with a neat arrest and a televised confession. Investigators identified a suspect connected to a string of small frauds involving fake inspections. Witness statements placed him near the lodge, and a partial fingerprint matched on a badge clip. Still, the second person remained unknown, and no clear motive beyond control and deception was proven. Official statements used careful language, noting the investigation remained open and evidence was incomplete. Tegan returned to the county office and filed the inspection as incomplete, with notes that felt unreal. For months after, Tegan kept replaying the moment the door shifted, like the building itself breathed. It was not a ghost story, and no one claimed anything supernatural happened in that lodge. It was just a plan, built from small choices, simple tools, and a confidence that nobody would look closely. Tegan learned that the scariest part was how ordinary everything looked until the pattern appeared. The stories. Locals warned about this abandoned cabin for years. The cabin sat back in the pines, and locals kept warning newcomers to stay away from it. Those warnings sounded like small-town drama until a maintenance worker found fresh boot prints in the dust. Kellen Brody was 36 and worked for the county parks department as a trails and facilities technician. On a cool weekday in early fall, he planned to swap a rotted signpost near a service road. The task was simple: drive out, set the post, snap a photo for records, then head back. He had done the same loop dozens of times, and he expected a quiet morning again. The service road cut through dense trees, and the radio lost signal not far from the highway. Kellen parked near a locked gate, then carried tools and a new sign down the old spur. Half a mile in, the trees opened around a clearing that should have been empty and flat. Instead, a cabin sat there, weathered boards and a sagging roof like it had been dropped from another decade. The cabin was not on his route sheet, and it was not in the park asset list either. Kellen had heard of it because people complained about trespassers and late-night fires near the clearing. A clerk at the front desk had once rolled her eyes and called it the cabin story again. Kellen never cared, because his job was signs, gates, and broken benches, not local legends. He set the new signpost first, then took a quick photo with his work phone for the file. When he turned back toward the cabin, he saw something that pulled him off his schedule. A line of boot prints crossed the clearing, dark and crisp in pale dirt, heading straight to the front steps. The prints looked fresh, and the last rain had been 2 days earlier. Kellen told himself it could be hikers, but the cabin sat outside any marked trail network. He walked closer, scanning for trash, smoke, or anything that could start a brush fire. At the base of the steps, he noticed a second set of prints that ended and did not return. The ground was soft enough to hold detail, yet there was no matching path back to the tree line. The front door hung slightly open, and the gap looked too clean for a place that abandoned. Kellen stopped on the bottom step, then called out with the polite voice of a worker in public space. He said, "County maintenance, anybody in there?" No one answered, and the cabin gave back only a dull creak from settling wood. He should have backed out and called a ranger, yet the missing return prints felt wrong. Kellen stepped onto the porch, and the boards complained under his weight. Near the threshold, he saw a smear on the doorframe, like a hand brushed it while entering. The smear was dark, but it could have been mud, and he could not tell from the angle. Kellen pushed the door wider with his glove, then leaned inside without fully crossing the threshold. The air smelled old, like damp paper and stale smoke, but it was not the sharp stink of a new fire. Light slipped through cracks in the boards, and dust floated in thin lines across the room. On the floor, a scatter of dry leaves formed a rough arrow pointing toward the back wall. His eyes adjusted, and he saw why locals might warn people away even without a ghost story. A narrow trapdoor sat near the hearth, and its edges were scraped clean, as if opened often. Next to it was a coil of nylon rope, pale and newer than anything else in the cabin. Kellen felt a cold pinch in his stomach, because rope did not belong in a forgotten structure. He backed out, set his tools down, and pulled his phone from his vest pocket. The service bar was still empty, but he could record what he saw for the supervisor later. He took photos of the prints, the rope, and the trapdoor, keeping each frame steady and clear. Then he tried calling again, and the call failed before it could ring. Kellen did not want to go under the cabin alone, and he knew that was a hard rule. Still, he could not stop thinking about the second set of prints that ended at the steps. He decided to do one more thing that stayed on the safe side of his job. He would check around the outside for a second exit, then leave and drive for signal. He walked the cabin perimeter, watching his footing on loose stones and roots. Behind the structure, a shallow trench ran along the foundation, filled with needles and old cans. Halfway down the back wall, the trench deepened and something metal glinted under dirt. Kellen crouched, brushed aside debris, and found a small square vent with a modern latch. The vent was nearly hidden, and it looked recently cleaned, which made it stand out. He did not open it, but he photographed it, then marked the spot in his phone notes. He typed short lines, cabin clearing, fresh prints, rope by trapdoor, vent with latch. He added the time, because details mattered when someone later asked what he had seen. By the time he returned to the gate, the quiet felt heavier than it should. Kellen loaded his tools, started the truck, and drove until his phone picked up a weak bar. He called his supervisor, then the regional ranger office, and he left a careful message. He said there were signs of activity at an abandoned cabin, and he was not going back alone. An hour later, a ranger named Sloane Maris met him at the gate with a second vehicle. Sloane was in her 40s, practical, and tired in the way of people who cover too much territory. She listened without interrupting, then asked for the photos and Kellen's exact walking route. Kellen handed over the phone, and she studied the prints and rope with a tight jaw. Sloane said the cabin was outside the official park map, but it still sat on public land. She also said locals called it the Long Cedar Place, and complaints came in every few months. Most reports were bonfires, dumped furniture, and teens daring each other to stay overnight. She did not mention ghosts, and her tone made it clear she did not want that part. They walked back together, and Kellen felt better with another set of footsteps beside his own. At the clearing, Sloane took her own photos, then measured the prints with a small ruler card. She pointed out that the deep heel marks suggested someone carrying weight going in. Then she paused at the steps, and she made a quiet sound, like a breath caught. There were two sets of prints now, and one set overlapped Kellen's earlier path. The newer set was lighter, and it came from the opposite edge of the clearing. It went to the porch, then turned and vanished near the front door, just like the other set. Sloane stared at the ground, then looked up at the trees as if expecting movement. She told Kellen to stay back, and she drew her radio even though the signal was poor. She tried the channel anyway, then switched to a second frequency and got only static. Kellen watched her shoulders tense, and he knew she was thinking about someone still inside. She stepped onto the porch, called out, and got the same silence Kellen had heard. Sloane did not go straight to the trap door, and that choice surprised Kellen. Instead, she moved to the side wall, then crouched near a warped window frame. She slid a small camera wand through a gap, and her face tightened as she watched the screen. Kellen could not see the display, but he saw her swallow, then pull the camera back slowly. She said there was a second door inside, not an exterior door, but a door that should not exist. She said it looked like it led into the wall, and the edges looked recently painted. Kellen blinked, because paint in that cabin would be like a bright flag in a swamp. Sloane told him to keep his distance, then she stepped into the cabin at last. Kellen stayed on the porch, angled so he could see the doorway and still watch the clearing. Inside, Sloane moved with careful steps, and the cabin groaned under her boots. He heard her say, "Ranger office. Identify yourself if you're here." Then he heard a faint click, like a latch turning, followed by a low drag across wood. Sloane backed out fast, and her expression had changed from caution to certainty. She said, "Someone is in there, and they have a way out you don't see." She told Kellen to return to the gate and wait, but he did not want to leave her alone. Sloane considered him for a moment, then told him to watch the tree line and stay silent. They held their positions for several minutes, and the only sound was wind through needles. Kellen's eyes kept returning to the boot prints that ended without a return path. He tried to picture how a person could step onto the porch and then disappear. Then he noticed something he had missed earlier, a thin line in the dirt beside the steps. The line was straight, like the track of something dragged, and it ran toward the side of the cabin. Kellen pointed it out, and Sloane nodded without taking her eyes off the doorway. She whispered, "That's a cover being pulled. Prosit." She moved along the porch edge, then dropped to one knee near the foundation. Near the porch corner, she found a plywood panel sunk into the ground like a loose hatch. Its top was dusted with dirt, but the corners were clean, like hands had lifted it often. Sloane used her knife to pry it, then held still, listening before she raised it fully. A cold draft rose from the opening, carrying the damp smell of soil and old concrete. Sloane kept her voice level and loud, and she called down into the dark. She said, "This is a ranger. Come up slowly and show your hands." For a few seconds, nothing happened, and Kellen felt his pulse thump in his ears. Then a voice answered, shaky and young, "Please, don't let him come back." A teenage boy climbed out, maybe 16, thin, covered in dust, and shaking hard. He looked at Kellen like he was trying to decide if he was real. Sloane guided him away from the hatch, then asked where the other person was. The boy swallowed, then said, "He's inside, and he locks the wall door." Sloane moved fast after that, and she told Kellen to stay with the boy. Kellen sat the kid on a rock and gave him water from his bottle. The boy held it with both hands, and his fingers would not stop trembling. He said his name was Rafi, and he had been working odd jobs with a man from a nearby town. Rafi said the man promised cash for hauling scrap out of the cabin and cleaning the clearing. Rafi also said the man called it a storage place, and he acted like he owned it. When Rafi asked why the cabin was not on any map, the man told him not to worry. Then, the first time Rafi saw the trap door, he realized it was not just a cabin. Rafi said there was a basement room under the cabin, with shelves and sealed plastic tubs. He said there were old tools, canned food, and stacks of papers wrapped in trash bags. He also said there were cameras, not new ones, but working ones with a small monitor. The man watched that monitor, and he told Rafi the cabin was safer than anywhere else. Kellen asked, "Safer from what?" Rafi looked toward the cabin, then lowered his voice like the trees could listen. He said people used to come here to hide, and they never left clean. He added that locals warned about it, because strangers always seemed to vanish around it. Kellen did not want to push a frightened kid, but the details sounded too organized for trespassing. He asked how Rafi got out, and Rafi pointed to the hatch under the porch. He said the man showed it once, bragging about how nobody could follow footprints. He said there was a tunnel that ran into the hillside, then split behind a false wall inside. While they talked, Sloane returned, breathing hard, and she looked like she had seen enough. She said the cabin was rigged with simple alarms, fishing line, and bells in the dust. She said the wall door led to a narrow corridor, and it was built with newer lumber. The corridor ended at the vent Kellen found, and it opened into a shallow ravine under brush. Sloane said the man was gone, and the only sign was a fresh scrape in the corridor dust. She called for backup again, and this time the radio caught a weak signal. She gave coordinates in plain language and asked for deputies and a medic for the kid. Then she told Kellen they needed to document everything before weather or animals erased it. They did it step by step, slow enough to be boring, because boring kept mistakes away. Sloane recorded a short video on her body camera, narrating each feature they found. Kellen took still photos with timestamps, then saved copies to a separate work folder. They photographed the rope, the trapdoor, the false wall seam, and the hidden hatch track. Sloane asked Rafi to describe the basement, and she wrote it down word for word. She asked about the papers, the tubs, and the cameras, and whether any names appeared. Rafi said the papers had dates, mostly older, like 1980-something and 2002. He said there were maps with circles and receipts from hardware stores and burner phones without service. He also said he saw a stack of cassette tapes in a milk crate, all labeled with weekdays. Sloan took that seriously because tapes meant recordings, and recordings meant evidence. She and Kellen entered together, and they kept their hands visible on camera the whole time. In the basement, they found the shelves Raffi described, and the monitor that still had a faint glow. The tubs were real, and the tapes were real, and the labels were written in careful block letters. They did not play the tapes there because they had to preserve the chain of custody. Still, Sloan photographed each label, and Kellen read them quietly as if they were fragile. Monday check-in, Tuesday check-in, Wednesday check-in, and so on, over and over. At the bottom of the crate was a single tape labeled Visitors with no date at all. There was also a binder, thick, with plastic sleeves holding printed pages. Kellen saw a page that looked like a call log, with times and short notes beside numbers. He saw phrases like gate open, truck passed, and lights in clearing, written without emotion. Sloan flipped to another page and found a list of names, but none were full names. They were nicknames like Skiff, Halo, and Brick, and each had a dollar amount beside it. Sloan said, "This is not a dare cabin." Kellen nodded, and he felt his mouth go dry as he looked at the tidy shelves. It felt like someone had been running a business, and the cabin was just the front. Raffi kept saying the man watched people, and those tapes made that claim feel more believable. When deputies finally arrived, the clearing filled with engines and voices, and the spell broke. Sloan briefed them, then handed over the tape crate and binder with careful signatures. A medic checked Raffi, and he did not have visible injuries beyond scrapes and dehydration. Raffi said he had been down there only overnight, but he thought it had been longer. Over the next week, Kellen got pulled into interviews and paperwork he never expected. He met with a county investigator who asked him to walk through every minute of his morning. He provided his photos, his notes, and his call attempts, and he signed statements twice. He also learned from Sloan that the cabin had a real history, and it was uglier than rumors. Reportedly, the cabin had belonged to a private hunting club decades earlier, then burned partially and was rebuilt. After that, it became a meeting spot for all kinds of people who wanted to avoid attention. An archive clerk found old complaints about shouting and headlights in the clearing dating back to 1996. There were also missing property reports, like tools and bikes, that clustered around the same months. The warnings locals gave were not supernatural, and they were not just about trespassing. They were about a place that made it easy to disappear for a night, or a week, or longer. The tunnel explained the missing footprints, and the false wall explained the vanishing act. What surprised everyone was how long the setup had lasted, and how calmly it was maintained. The twist came from the tapes, once they were reviewed in a controlled lab. According to the investigator, several tapes captured short conversations, not confessions, but transactions and threats. One tape, the visitor's tape, included a voice that matched a former county contractor. That contractor had worked on culverts and drainage years earlier, and he had access to equipment and permits. The case tightened when purchase records matched lumber and vent hardware to a job billed as erosion control. The hidden vent was installed under cover of that work, and it blended into real maintenance. It meant the cabin was not just an accident of history, it was updated with official-looking paperwork. That was why it stayed off radar, because it hid behind normal processes and boring invoices. Kellen kept thinking about the moment he saw the prints that did not return. He realized the warning was never about the cabin itself, it was about the system around it. A place can be rotten and still look ordinary, especially when someone keeps it swept. When he drove past the gate later, the clearing was empty again, and the cabin was finally boarded up. Raffi was placed with relatives, and his statement became a small hinge in a bigger investigation. Sloan kept her tone steady whenever Kellen asked how it ended, because cases like that rarely end clean. She did say the main suspect vanished before arrest, and that alone kept the locals uneasy. Still, the tunnel was sealed, the tapes were secured, and the cabin stopped being useful. Months later, Kellen replaced the signpost again, because weather never stops doing its own work. He stood at the edge of the clearing and listened to the ordinary forest sounds. The cabin looked smaller with boards across every opening, like a mouth forced shut. Kellen understood why people warned others for years, even if they never knew the exact reason. He walked back to his truck, and he did not glance over his shoulder this time. Some places earn their reputation the slow way, through patterns people notice without proof. This one earned it through careful planning and through a hidden door that erased footsteps. And for once, the warning finally matched the truth, even if the truth arrived late. The stories. The unsettling truth about this church basement. The first dispatch note called it a welfare check, but the basement door was bolted from the outside. By dawn, the church had taped off its own hallway, and nobody could agree on what they heard. In a river town in the upper Midwest, the old brick church sat 1 block from the courthouse. It was the kind of place that hosted potlucks, weddings, and quiet funerals all year. On a humid Tuesday in late summer, a man named Teague Ralston showed up early. Teague was 36, and he worked as a municipal building inspector for the county. He planned to finish one routine inspection, then grab coffee before his afternoon meetings. The church had applied for a permit to replace a stairwell near the basement steps. Teague had signed off on similar work dozens of times, and he expected nothing unusual. The pastor met him at the side entrance, smiling like this was an easy win. Her name was MrBallen, and she looked tired under her neat hair. She apologized for the smell of paint, then said the contractor was running late. Teague asked for the basement access, since that was where the steps started. Maris led him down a narrow hallway, past a bulletin board and a locked office door. At the end, a heavy metal door sat under a faded exit sign. Maris reached for her keyring, then stopped and frowned at the latch. The padlock was already on, and it was snapped shut. Maris said, "That's not ours. We don't lock it like that." Teague leaned close and saw a fresh scratch in the metal near the staple. It looked like someone had forced the lock into place with a tool. He asked who had a key, and Maris shook her head too quickly. Teague didn't like surprises, especially around fire egress and public spaces. He told Maris he needed the lock removed, and he would note it in his report. Maris tried to laugh, then said, "Maybe the contractor did it for safety." Teague asked for the contractor's name, and she gave a company he recognized. He called the number from his phone, and it went to a generic voicemail prompt. A muffled thump came from the other side of the door. It wasn't loud, but it had weight, like a knee hitting a wall. Maris went still, then whispered, "Did you hear that?" Teague put his ear near the seam, and he heard a faint dragging sound. It lasted only a second, then there was silence again. Teague stepped back and asked if anyone was down there. Maris said the basement was empty, and her voice sounded practiced. Teague tried the handle anyway, and it didn't budge. He told Maris he was calling it in because a locked basement wasn't normal. Maris lifted her hands, then said, "Please, don't make a scene." Teague called the non-emergency line for the police department. He kept his voice calm, and he described the lock and the noise. The dispatcher asked if he saw smoke or immediate danger, and he said no. Then the dispatcher asked if anyone was missing, and Teague hesitated. Maris answered that nobody was missing, but she sounded irritated. The dispatcher said an officer would come by when available. Teague didn't love that, so he tried the door again, harder this time. The metal rattled, and the padlock held. Another thump came from inside, followed by what sounded like a quick breath. Teague looked at Maris, and she stared at the floor tiles. He told her he was going to step outside and find a tool. Maris said, "You can't break church property." Teague said, "Someone might be trapped. I'm not waiting." He walked out to his truck, grabbed a small bolt cutter, and headed back inside. He carried it like it was just another piece of work gear. Maris followed him, and her shoes squeaked on the tile. She said the church had an old fallout shelter room down there. Nothing more. Teague asked why a fallout room would need a fresh padlock. Maris said, "It's complicated. We just need time." Teague didn't answer because his focus had narrowed to the lock. He knelt, set the cutter jaws, and squeezed. The lock resisted, then snapped with a sharp crack. The door swung inward an inch, as if pressure had been holding it closed. A breath of air spilled out, sour and damp, like wet cardboard and old bleach. Teague pulled the door open and stepped into the stairwell. The light switch didn't work, so he used his phone flashlight. The steps were steep, and the handrail was new, still sticky with paint. Halfway down, he saw scuff marks on the wall, like heels had kicked during a struggle. At the bottom, the basement opened into a wide room with folding tables stacked neatly. Teague called out again, and his voice echoed off concrete. A soft whimper answered from behind a partition wall near the furnace room. He moved slowly, keeping his light low, and he saw a figure crouched by a pipe. It was a young man, late teens maybe, with wrists red and raw. Duct tape lay on the floor beside him, torn and dirty. The young man flinched when the light hit his face. He raised his hands and said, "Don't close it. Please don't close it." Teague said, "It's open. You're okay. What's your name?" The young man swallowed and said, "Kellen. Kellen Drex." His voice was hoarse, like he had been shouting for hours. Teague asked if anyone else was down there. Kellen shook his head, then pointed toward a storage closet. He said, "They moved the stuff," they said, "to keep quiet." Teague asked who, and Kellen's eyes darted upward toward the stairs. He said, "Church people. Not all, just some." Teague told him he was calling police again, and he did it immediately. This time, he said there was a restrained person in the basement. The dispatcher's tone changed, and she said officers were on the way. Teague stayed between Kellen and the stairs, watching the doorway like it might bite. Maris appeared at the top step, framed by the hallway light. She looked down and froze when she saw Kellen. Her face went pale, then her jaw tightened like she was forcing herself to breathe. She started down one step, then stopped, gripping the rail. Teague said, "Don't come closer, just wait upstairs." Maris said, "Kellen, what are you doing here?" Kellen didn't answer, and his shoulders shook with contained sobs. Teague watched Maris's hands, because they were trembling. She said, "This isn't what it looks like." Teague said, "It looks like someone locked him in." Maris backed up without another word. Teague heard her shoes retreat, then a door slam somewhere above. For a moment, the basement felt even colder, despite the humid air. Kellen whispered, "She's not the worst one." Teague asked who was, and Kellen stared at the concrete. 2 officers arrived within minutes, according to later timestamps in the logs. They came down cautiously, hands near their belts, lights sweeping the corners. Teague explained what happened, and Kellen repeated his name and age. He said he was 19, and he had come to talk to someone at the church. He claimed he had been in a counseling session, then told to wait downstairs. Kellen said he asked to leave, and someone blocked the stairs. He said there were voices, then tape, then the click of a lock. He couldn't name everyone, but he described one man with a heavy ring. He remembered the ring because it scratched his cheek when tape was pressed down. He also remembered a sweet chemical smell, like a cleaner or solvent. The officers took Kellen upstairs and sat him on a chair in the fellowship hall. They asked Teague to stay. Since he was a witness and the one who cut the lock, Teague sat at a table with a paper cup of water, hands still buzzing. A third officer walked through the building, checking rooms and doors. The basement door was now open, and a strip of tape marked it as a scene. Maris finally returned, with another person close behind her. It was a man in a suit jacket, older, broad-shouldered, and polished-looking. He introduced himself as the church administrator, Hollis Quaid. He asked why police were in his building, and his tone was offended. One officer said there was a report of unlawful restraint, and Hollis smiled tightly. Hollis said, "This is a misunderstanding. The young man is unstable." Kellen looked up at that, and his mouth opened in disbelief. He said, "I asked to leave? You told them to lock it." Hollis raised a hand and said, "Son, you were a danger to yourself." Kellen shook his head, and tears rolled down his cheeks. Teague watched Hollis, and he noticed something small. On Hollis's right hand, a thick ring glinted under the hall lights. It was silver, with a dark stone that looked almost black. Teague remembered Kellen's detail, and his stomach tightened again. He told the officer quietly about the ring description and the scratch detail. The officers asked Hollis to step aside, and they requested keys and records. Hollis said the church kept counseling notes confidential, protected by policy. The officer said policy wasn't the same as law, and he asked again. Maris stood behind Hollis, eyes on the floor, hands clasped so hard her knuckles whitened. The air in the room felt thin, like everyone was holding their breath at once. Kellen asked for his phone, and he said it was taken from him. He said his backpack was in the basement storage closet. An officer went down with Teague and retrieved it, carefully, like evidence. Inside the backpack was a notebook with scribbled dates and names. There was also a small digital voice recorder, the kind used for lectures. Kellen said he carried it because he forgot things when he got anxious. He said he recorded meetings sometimes so he could replay them later. The officers exchanged a look, and one of them asked if he recorded today. Kellen nodded and said, "I think it's still running." Teague felt a cold flush, because that meant everything might be on tape. The recorder was still on, and its red light blinked weakly. The officer stopped it, bagged it, and noted the time. They didn't play it there, but later reports referenced a partial audio file. It reportedly captured voices arguing about liability, reputation, and keeping things contained. It also reportedly captured a sentence about the lock, spoken like an instruction. Teague didn't hear the audio himself, not that day. What he saw was the way Hollis's confidence cracked when the recorder appeared. His smile faded, and his eyes went sharp, like a cornered animal. He asked who was allowed to record, and an officer told him to stay quiet. Maris's face looked like it might fold in half, and she pressed a palm to her mouth. Kellen also had photos on his phone, which officers later recovered from the basement. He had snapped pictures of a hallway bulletin board before the session started. The photos showed a calendar with handwritten blocks and initials beside time slots. There were also sticky notes with room numbers, and one said basement. Another said lock check, with a date written for that morning. Teague asked how Kellen took photos if his phone was taken. Kellen said he took them earlier when nobody was watching, then hid the phone briefly. He said someone found it later, after he asked to leave. That detail sounded messy, but it also sounded like the truth. The photos had timestamps that fit the sequence, according to the officer's comment. By late afternoon, investigators from the county arrived. They took statements, photographed the lock, and measured the scuff marks on the wall. They also photographed the new handrail and the paint that smeared near the scratches. A technician swabbed the tape scraps for residue and fingerprints. Teague watched from the side, trying to make his breathing slow and steady. Kellen was taken to a clinic for evaluation, mostly for dehydration and stress. A nurse later noted bruising consistent with restraint, according to a summary Teague heard. The clinic also documented abrasions on his wrists and cheek. None of it proved motive, but it supported Kellen's story. Teague sat in his truck afterward, hands on the wheel, not turning the key. He went back to his office and filed his inspection report anyway. He noted the padlocked egress door, the broken lock, and the potential hazard. He attached photos he took after police arrived, keeping them factual and clean. He also wrote a separate memo for his supervisor, because this felt bigger. His supervisor told him to forward everything to the county attorney's office. Over the next week, rumors spread through town faster than any official update. People argued at diners, in parking lots, and on church steps after Sunday service. Some said Kellen was trespassing. Others said the church was hiding something. Teague tried to keep his head down, but he kept getting calls. A local reporter left voicemails asking for comment, and he never answered. Then, a new detail surfaced, and it shifted the whole story. A retired maintenance worker came forward after seeing the news segment. He said the basement door had been altered years earlier. He said the church once had a crash bar on the inside, but it was removed. He said he complained, and he was told it was temporary during renovations. The maintenance worker provided an old photo taken during a volunteer workday. It showed the same door, but with the crash bar still installed. In the background, a whiteboard listed tasks, and one line said, "Remove bar." The date on the whiteboard was written in thick marker, 2012. Teague stared at the photo in disbelief, because it matched what he saw now. That meant the basement exit had been made easier to trap from the outside. Teague realized the padlock was not an accident or a one-time panic. It looked more like a system, slowly built to be invisible. A door that should always open had been turned into a cage. The unsettling truth wasn't only what happened to Kellen, it was how ready the building was. Investigators requested records related to renovations and safety inspections. They also subpoenaed emails from the church's administrative accounts. According to later summaries, certain messages referenced discretion and risk management. There were also references to a room used for difficult conversations. Nobody wrote the word basement as a confession, but the hints lined up. Teague was asked to come in for a follow-up interview. He described the lock, the noises, Maris's reaction, and Hollis's ring. He also mentioned the smell of cleaner, since Kellen remembered it too. An investigator told him they found a jug of industrial solvent downstairs. It was used for stripping floors, but it also made tape stick better for a while. Weeks later, the county released a statement that charges were being considered. They didn't name suspects in public, but they confirmed a continuing inquiry. The church suspended counseling sessions and closed the basement to the public. Hollis resigned, citing health reasons, and Maris took a leave of absence. None of that felt like closure. It felt like a curtain drawn quickly. Teague kept thinking about the moment the lock snapped. He had expected an empty room and a minor code violation. Instead, he found a person waiting in the dark, trying not to panic. He wondered how many others had sat down there and stayed quiet. He wondered how many people believed it was for their own good. Callan eventually moved away, according to a neighbor who spoke to Teague later. He didn't want to be known as the basement kid for the rest of his life. Teague respected that, and he never tried to contact him again. He kept his role small, just a witness who did his job. Still, the sound of that thump behind the door stayed with him. On certain mornings, Teague drove past the church on his way to inspections. The building looked the same from the street, steady and respectable. Sunlight hit the stained glass, and cars lined the curb for community events. But Teague knew what could be hidden behind a quiet hallway. He learned that safety wasn't only codes and rails, it was who held the keys. The stories. The most troubling cases of missing hikers. The case file was thin, but the silence around it was heavy. It started with a trail register page that ended mid-sentence, and nobody could explain why. In early October of 2017, Lyle Maris was 38 and worked as a county records clerk. He handled archived reports, public requests, and the boring paperwork that kept a small sheriff office afloat. That morning, he planned to scan old search logs, then get home before the first hard rain. He did not plan to reopen a missing hikers case that everyone acted allergic to. The request came in a plain envelope with no return address and a sticky note inside. The note asked for copies of 3 files, all tied to the same state forest trail system. It also included a date range, and it ended with one sentence that felt like a dare. Do not call it an accident until you read the audio. Lyle was used to weird mail, but this one carried details only staff should know. He pulled the files from the back room, and he noticed something immediately. Each folder had the same handwriting on the spine and a strip of tape over the label. The tape looked old, and it had been trimmed clean, like someone wanted it to look official. The first file was from late summer of 2011, involving 2-day hikers. They parked at a trailhead near a reservoir and never returned before dark. Search teams found their car, their lunches, and their jackets folded on the back seat. The report said there was no sign of foul play, but it also said the keys were missing. The second file was from 2013, involving a couple and their dog. Witness statements placed them on the main trail at noon, heading toward a fire lookout. The dog was found the next day, wet and shaking, with a leash still attached. The couple was never found, and the report ended with a single line about bad weather. The third file was newer, from late spring of 2015, involving a lone hiker. Her friends said she was careful, and she always texted when she hit a landmark. Her phone last pinged near an old service road, then went quiet like it had been turned off. Searchers found her pack under a downed log, and it was neatly zipped and dry. Lyle did not like the pattern, but he could not say why yet. None of the cases were famous, and they were not tied to any public scandal. Still, someone had blocked the labels, and someone wanted the audio. Lyle checked the file inventory, and he saw a line item called Field Recording Station Copy. The sheriff office kept old audio in a small evidence room, but access was logged. Lyle asked the evidence tech, a man named Bracken Rudd, 46, civilian specialist. Bracken said the tapes were real, and he looked annoyed that Lyle even knew about them. He said the recordings came from a volunteer search leader who carried a handheld radio. Then he added that the recordings were mostly wind and there was nothing helpful. Lyle asked if he could listen anyway, because the request specifically mentioned audio. Bracken shrugged, then signed the checkout in a slow and careful way. He handed Lyle a small digital file player with a single folder loaded onto it. The folder name matched the trail system, and it held 3 audio clips. Lyle listened at his desk with cheap headphones, trying to keep his face neutral. The first clip started with radio chatter, then a pause, Then a clipped female voice. Copy, Team 2 is at marker 7. Hearing something ahead might be hikers. Then there was a low sound under the static, like a steady tone that wavered. The voice returned, quieter now, and it did not sound like she was joking. Someone is whistling. It is close, but I do not see anybody on the trail. A second voice replied from base, asking if she meant a bird call. She said no, and then the clip ended with a sharp click. The second clip was longer and worse because it included more than one witness. A man spoke first, and he was breathing hard, like he had been running uphill. Base, this is Ridge Team. We found the dog, no people. The dog keeps pulling north. Base asked for location, and he gave a marker number and a creek crossing. Then the same low tone appeared again, faint but constant, riding under every word. The man said, "Do you hear that? Tell me you hear that." Base replied, "Negative. Copy your traffic. What is the sound on your end?" The man did not answer right away, and when he did, his voice had changed. "It is like a phone ringing, but not right. It is coming from the trees." Another voice joined in, a woman, and she sounded angry and scared at the same time. "Stop calling back. Whoever is doing it is moving. It keeps pacing us." Base told them to regroup, and the clip ended with heavy footsteps and a curse. The third clip was from the 2015 case, and it started calm. A volunteer said they had found the pack, and it looked staged, not dropped. Base asked what he meant, and he said the pack was clean and centered on the log. Then the tone appeared again, louder this time, and it pulsed like a slow alarm. The volunteer lowered his voice, like he was afraid the radio itself could betray him. "Someone is answering our calls. Not on the repeater. It is local, like line of sight." Base asked who was answering, and the volunteer said he could not see them. He added one detail that made Lyle pause with his hand on the volume knob. "It is using her voice. It is using her exact voice." Base demanded he repeat, and the volunteer said, "It is her. It is the missing hiker." Then a sound cut through the tone, a short laugh, and it was too clean to be wind. The clip ended right after, as if somebody had hit stop on purpose. Lyle sat back, and he felt his throat tighten in a way he could not explain. He had heard enough dispatch audio to know when something was off. Voices on radios can warp, but this sounded like a deliberate imitation. He checked the player, and he saw a note field attached to the third clip. The note was time-stamped, and it said, "Do not release, causes copycat behavior." Lyle stared at it, because it did not sound like normal evidence language. He opened the case file again and looked for the author of the note. It was signed by a lieutenant who retired years ago and who had a reputation for control. Lyle did what records clerks do when they get nervous. He went to the paper trail, because paper does not care about feelings. He pulled dispatch logs for the search days, and he compared timestamps to the clips. The audio did not match the official logs, not perfectly, not even close. In the 2011 case, the log showed no mention of whistling. In the 2013 case, the log listed routine updates and nothing unusual. In the 2015 case, the log said the pack was found, then it jumped ahead. The gap was 47 minutes, and the log had a generic entry that did not explain it. Lyle printed the pages, then walked them to the deputy captain, who oversaw records. The captain was named Odessa Train, 52, patrol supervisor, and she had seen everything. She read the pages, then listened to the clips with a stiff jaw. When she finished, she did not say it was fake, and she did not say it was real. She asked where Lyle got the player, and he said from evidence checkout. She asked who else had access, and he named Bracken and a few supervisors. Odessa told Lyle to stop working the case, but her tone was not angry. It sounded like caution, the kind that comes from knowing a door should stay shut. Lyle nodded, but he could not let it go after hearing the imitation claim. He asked Odessa one direct question, and he kept his voice low. "Did anybody ever find the source of that tone?" Odessa held his eyes for a moment, then said, "They said it was interference." That answer was not satisfying, because interference does not track across years like a fingerprint. Lyle went home with the envelope still on his desk, and he barely tasted dinner. That night, he searched old newspaper microfilm, because the internet did not hold local history. He found brief articles about each case, but they all shared one strange detail. Each article mentioned a ranger station hotline set up for tips. The number was printed, then removed in later editions, like it had been a mistake. Lyle checked the old phone list, and he found the number was still active. It rang to a recorded message that said the station was closed for the season. The next morning, Lyle arrived early and asked Bracken about the hotline number. Bracken stiffened, then said that number belonged to a radio patch line, not a public phone. He said it was used during searches to bridge handheld radios to dispatch when coverage failed. Lyle asked why a patch line had a public recording, and Bracken said he did not know. Lyle did not press harder, because Bracken looked like he wanted to end the conversation. Instead, Lyle called the number from his desk phone, then held his recorder near the speaker. The message played, and it sounded normal at first, like any board announcement voice. Then, under the words, the low tone crept in. Faint, but present, like a shadow. Lyle stopped the recording, then replayed it, and the tone was still there. He called again, and the tone shifted slightly, like it was responding to the call. He did it a third time, and he heard a tiny click between phrases. It was the same click that ended the first clip from 2011. Lyle brought his recording to Odessa, and this time she did not tell him to stop. She told him to sit down, then she locked her office door. Odessa said there was something older than the three cases, and it was why people avoided them. She said a decade earlier, a volunteer had abused the patch system to prank search teams. According to witness statements, the volunteer used the patch to mimic lost hikers on radio. He did it to keep morale up and to test response time, and it went too far. A young deputy confronted him in the woods, and a fight happened near a ravine. The volunteer fell, and the deputy claimed it was an accident, and the file vanished. Odessa said the patch line was never fully decommissioned after that. It stayed because it was useful and because nobody wanted to admit the history. She said some supervisors treated it like a ghost story and others treated it like leverage. When new hikers went missing, the old prank story came back, like a stain that would not wash. Lyle asked if that explained the imitation voice in the 2015 audio. Odessa said it could, but only if somebody still had access and still wanted control. She said the most troubling part was not the tone or the voice. It was the way the official logs had been cleaned, as if someone edited reality after the fact. Together, they pulled the maintenance records for the patch system. They found work orders signed by the retired lieutenant years after his supposed retirement. The signatures matched his style, and the dates aligned with the 3 search periods. It looked like he kept his hands on the system, even after he stopped wearing a badge. Odessa contacted the county IT contractor who handled old radio gear, a man named Kellen Swope, 44. Kellen agreed to inspect the patch cabinet at the ranger station site. He found a hidden add-on board that allowed call forwarding and voice playback. It was not standard equipment, and it was installed cleanly, like someone knew what they were doing. Kellen also found a small memory card taped inside the cabinet. The card contained voice samples labeled with dates and trail marker numbers. Some samples were harmless, like volunteers calling in their positions. Others were short clips of hikers on the day they vanished, taken from tip line voicemails. That was the payoff nobody wanted, because it tied the missing hikers to a human choice. Someone had been collecting their voices, then using those voices during searches. It did not prove the same person caused the disappearances, and Odessa was careful about that. But it proved someone exploited the chaos, and someone wanted the searches to move a certain way. In one file, a witness had reported hearing a phone ring in the trees near a creek. The search team went toward the sound, and they left the main trail for almost an hour. In another file, a volunteer heard a voice call her name from a ravine, and she went alone. She later told investigators she felt embarrassed because it sounded like her missing friend. Those moments were the cracks, and someone had been pushing on them. Odessa opened an internal investigation, and the county prosecutor reviewed what they could prove. The retired lieutenant was questioned, and he denied installing anything. He said the card was planted, and he said the clips were taken out of context. No public arrest followed, at least not in a way the town could point to and feel satisfied. But the ranger station patch line was shut down, and the hotline number went dead. New policy required sealed logs and outside audits during every future search. The 3 cases remained unsolved because the woods do not offer clean answers. Still, the way the searches unfolded now had a more believable explanation. Lyle kept thinking about the envelope and the sticky note, and who sent it. He asked Odessa if she knew, and she said she had a strong guess. She believed it was a former volunteer, someone who felt guilty and wanted the truth on record. That person did not want credit and did not want to be seen as a snitch in a small county. Weeks later, Lyle returned the files to storage and retaped the labels properly. He did not do it to hide them, he did it to mark them as normal evidence again. Some cases become legends, and legends make people careless in the wrong ways. These cases were troubling because they showed how easy it is to steer a search. When hikers vanish, the first enemy is time, and the second enemy is confusion. A single false sound can move trained people off a trail and into wasted hours. The woods can be cruel on their own, but people can make them worse. That is why the most troubling cases are not always about what happened out there. The stories. Paramedic who broke protocol after the storm. The run sheet said the call never happened, but 3 witnesses remembered the ambulance anyway. The medic who signed it broke protocol, and the storm was only part of the reason. In early September of 2019, Reeve Donlin was 39 and worked as a paramedic for a county EMS service. He lived in a small river town in the Midwest, where storms tore up trees and power lines every summer. That morning, the remnants of a hurricane had drifted inland, dumping rain hard for hours. By noon, the river spilled into streets, and the dispatch center started stacking calls like plates. Reeve showed up for a 12-hour shift with dry socks, extra gloves, and a calm face. His partner, Talia Mendez, was 27 and a brand new EMT who still checked everything twice. They stocked the truck, ran their radio check, and waited in the bay with doors open. The supervisor told crews to stage on high ground and avoid floodwater. No exceptions today. Reeve nodded like always, but his eyes stayed on the weather map taped to the wall. He had worked enough storms to know the map never showed the small disasters. Their first calls were simple: a fall in a dark stairwell, a diabetic who ran out of insulin. They moved slow because debris made every street feel like a maze. Around 4:30, the radio crackled with a priority tone that made Talia sit up straight. Dispatch gave an address near the river, then stopped and corrected it to a cross street. The dispatcher's voice sounded tight, like she had been arguing with someone off mic. The note said, "Possible trapped person, caller unsure, water rising." The supervisor came on next and repeated the standing order about not entering flood zones. Reeve keyed up and asked if fire was en route for water rescue support. The supervisor said resources were thin and crews should not self-deploy into danger. Reeve acknowledged, then stared at the tablet, reading the caller number and name. The caller name matched someone Reeve recognized from a prior overdose call, a man named Kester Vale. Kester lived in a rental house near the river with a porch that sagged like a tired jaw. Reeve remembered Kester as loud, scared, and protective of his younger sister. That sister, Marlon Vale, had asthma and a heart condition, according to old chart notes. Reeve also remembered the last crew found their smoke detectors missing. Talia asked if they should stage at the edge and wait for fire, like they were told. Reeve said yes, but he turned the wheel toward the river anyway, taking the shortest route. They stopped where the pavement dipped into brown water and the barricade floated sideways. A neighbor waved both arms from a driveway, yelling something that the rain swallowed. Reeve got out, boots sinking in mud, and asked where the caller was. The neighbor pointed at the Vale house, and the porch light blinked like a weak heartbeat. Water covered the front steps, and the yard looked like a shallow lake. Kester stood at a window, banging on the glass with his palm, face pale and furious. Reeve walked closer until the water reached his knees, then stopped and assessed. He could see Marlon inside, sitting on the couch, shoulders hunched, breathing fast. Talia stayed by the truck, scanning for drifting debris and watching the water level. Reeve called fire dispatch on the radio and asked again for a rescue team. The dispatcher said units were tied up and an estimated arrival time was unknown. Kester slammed the window again and shouted, "She can't breathe! She's turning gray!" Reeve looked at Marlon's lips, and even through glass, he saw a bluish tint. Protocol said, "Wait, do not enter moving water, do not compromise the crew for one patient." Reeve knew the rule, and he had repeated it to rookies a dozen times. He also knew asthma did not politely pause while resources got sorted. He called his supervisor and described what he saw, then asked for permission to enter. The supervisor said no and added that any entry would be considered a direct violation. Reeve ended the call and took one more look at Marlon's posture and the panic in her eyes. He told Talia to keep the truck in place and to call for law and fire again. Talia asked if he was serious, and Reeve said, "Stay dry and keep eyes on me." Then he waded forward, one step at a time, feeling the push of water on his thighs. He reached the porch rail, grabbed it, and pulled himself to the door. Kester opened it fast, and the smell inside hit like wet carpet and old cigarettes. Reeve told Kester to move back, then stepped into ankle-deep water on the living room floor. Marlon tried to speak, but her words came out broken and thin. Reeve knelt beside her, checked her pulse, and listened to her lungs. The wheeze was tight, and her oxygen level on the finger clip was dropping fast. He reached for his kit and realized the bag was still with Talia at the truck. Reeve swore under his breath and asked Kester if they had any inhalers. Kester ran to a kitchen drawer and returned with a rescue inhaler with a cracked cap. Reeve checked the label and saw it was expired, but it was better than nothing. He coached Marlon through 2 puffs, then watched her chest keep fighting. Her breathing did not ease, and her hands started to tremble in a way Reeve did not like. He needed a nebulizer treatment and oxygen, and he needed it now. He asked Kester where the nearest high spot was, and Kester pointed toward a back window. Behind the house, the ground rose slightly, but the walkway was narrow and clogged with branches. Reeve decided to move Marlon out, even if it meant carrying her through water. He called to Talia through the open door, and his voice sounded small in the rain. Talia ran closer with the jump bag and the oxygen kit held over her head. She stopped at the water line and looked at Reeve like she wanted to argue. Reeve told her to stay at the edge and hand him what he asked for. Talia slid the oxygen tubing and mask across the porch rail like a lifeline. Reeve put the mask on Marlon, opened the valve, and watched her shoulders loosen slightly. He set up the nebulizer with albuterol, hands steady even as water bumped his knees. Marlon's eyes stayed locked on him, desperate and trusting in a way that felt heavy. Kester hovered close, asking if she was dying, and Reeve told him to help by staying quiet. The treatment ran, and the wheeze softened, but it did not clear the way Reeve expected. That was when Reeve noticed bruising on Marlon's neck, faint fingerprints under damp hair. He did not react outwardly, but his mind filed it away with a cold click. He asked Marlon what happened before the breathing got bad, and she glanced at Kester first. Marlon said, "I slipped," then looked down, then added, "I fell in the hallway." Reeve asked where, and Marlon pointed toward a door that led to the back room. Reeve told Kester to keep holding the oxygen, then moved toward the back room carefully. He opened the door and saw a mattress on the floor, a space heater, and a chain lock on the inside. The chain lock was mounted high, like it was meant to keep someone in, not keep someone out. There was also a phone on the mattress with a cracked screen, and it was powered off. Reeve stood still, hearing the rain outside, and felt the call shift in his gut. He returned to Marlon and asked if she had called 911 herself. Marlon shook her head, then nodded, then said, "I tried, but it wouldn't work." Kester cut in and said the cell towers were down, and that was why he called from a neighbor. Reeve asked the neighbor's name, and Kester hesitated before answering. Talia caught that hesitation, and her eyes flicked to Reeve with a silent question. Marlon's breathing improved enough to move, so Reeve chose the back window exit. He and Kester carried her together, Reeve supporting her shoulders and Kester lifting her legs. They stepped into water again, pushing through branches, and Reeve kept talking to Marlon steadily. Talia followed along the higher edge, keeping oxygen flowing, watching for slips. They reached the small rise behind the house, where the mud was thick but not submerged. Reeve radioed that they had a patient and needed a clear route to transport. The supervisor replied with a clipped tone, asking why the crew entered the flood zone. Reeve said, "Patient was failing, no rescue resources available," and kept his voice controlled. The supervisor told them to return to staging and wait for fire to assist extraction. Reeve looked at Marlon, saw her lips still tinted, and decided he was done waiting. He loaded Marlon onto the stretcher on the high ground, then angled it toward a neighbor's driveway. The driveway sloped upward to dry pavement, and it was passable if they moved fast. They rolled the stretcher, wheels bouncing, while Kester ran ahead, clearing branches. Talia stayed near the head of the stretcher, keeping the mask sealed, face tense and focused. They got Marlon into the ambulance and started toward the hospital without lights to avoid debris panic. On the way, Reeve documented everything out loud so the dash audio captured it. He said arrival time, patient condition, oxygen levels, treatment given, and response observed. He also said noted bruising on neck, pattern consistent with grip, keeping the tone neutral. Talia stared at him, surprised, then looked back to Marlon, who had drifted into shallow sleep. Reeve called the receiving hospital and gave a report, including the bruising and the locked room. At the hospital, staff moved Marlon into a bay, placed monitors, and started additional breathing support. A nurse asked Kester to wait outside, and Kester argued until security stepped in. Reeve watched Kester's eyes, calculating and angry, then watched him step back too quickly. Talia whispered, "That didn't feel right," and Reeve nodded without looking at her. He finished the electronic chart, then paused at the signature line. Protocol violation meant the chart would draw attention, and attention meant questions about the house. Reeve had a choice, and he made it in a quiet, uncomfortable way. He entered the call as a different location, the dry driveway, not the flooded home. He left out the chain lock detail, and he described the bruising as possible injury from fall. Talia saw the entries and asked why he was softening it, and Reeve said, "Trust me for now." Back at the station, the supervisor called Reeve into an office and shut the door. He said the crew had endangered themselves and the truck, and the county could face liability. Reeve did not argue about the water, because the facts were the facts. He said the patient would have died if they waited, and he meant it. The supervisor said the run sheet looked clean enough, then asked who told Reeve about the address. That question landed wrong, like the supervisor cared more about blame than care. Reeve said dispatch gave it, and the supervisor said dispatch records were being audited. He warned Reeve not to freelance during a declared emergency, then dismissed him with a cold stare. Outside, Talia waited, and she asked if they were fired. Reeve told her no, but he said they needed to keep their own notes. Reeve went home and opened a notebook he kept for odd calls, writing the timeline carefully. He wrote the door chain detail, the powered-off phone, and Kester's hesitation about the neighbor. He also wrote that the supervisor seemed too eager for the chart to look tidy. The next day, he called an old friend who worked in hospital administration off the record. The friend said Marlon was stable, but she asked to speak to someone without family present. That was when the story cracked open into something larger than a storm call. According to a nurse statement later filed, Marlon said Kester had been keeping her inside. She reportedly said he took her phone, locked the back room, and used fear to control her. She also reportedly said the storm was his excuse because no one would come quickly. The nurse called social services, and law enforcement opened a separate inquiry. Reeve's run sheet, however, did not match the nurse timeline, and that mismatch mattered. A week later, Internal Affairs pulled radio traffic, dispatch logs, and the ambulance GPS history. They noticed the truck entered a restricted flood zone and stayed there for 17 minutes. The supervisor claimed he was never told the patient was in distress, which contradicted the recorded call. Reeve requested the audio, and when he heard it, he caught something that made his jaw tighten. There was a gap in the supervisor's radio response, like a clipped section, not just static. Reeve asked dispatch for the raw recording, not the stitched file used for review. A dispatcher named Cora Helvey met him at a coffee shop, careful and nervous. She said she was not supposed to share anything, but she hated what was happening. Cora said the supervisor had direct access to the recording system during emergencies. She also said he sometimes cleaned up audio when crews got complaints. Reeve did not record Cora, but he wrote down what she said, time and date included. He then requested a public records copy through the county clerk, using the proper process. The response came back with a note that certain files were exempt due to personnel review. That answer did not deny the files existed, and it did not confirm they were intact. Reeve kept pushing, not loudly, but steadily, the way he handled stubborn insurance forms. Meanwhile, detectives interviewed the neighbor who owned the driveway where Marlon was loaded. The neighbor confirmed Kester ran to his house and demanded to use his phone. He also said Kester was already soaked, like he had been in the water before calling. The neighbor said he heard shouting inside the Vale house earlier, before the worst rain. Those details showed up in witness statements, and they lined up with what Reeves suspected. The twist came from something small, and it came from Talia's attention to details. She remembered the cracked inhaler Kester handed over, and she remembered the pharmacy label. The label had Marlon's name, but it had a refill date from 2 months earlier. That meant Marlon had not been cut off from care, at least not entirely. It also meant someone was controlling her access in a way that looked normal on paper. Talia visited the pharmacy after her shift and spoke to a technician she knew from school. The technician said Kester picked up Marlon's meds most months, and he signed for them himself. He also asked for her records once, claiming insurance problems after a storm claim denial. That detail sounded like nothing, until Reeve connected it to his own job history. Reeve had inspected a roof on Kester's street the previous year and denied part of a claim. Reeve pulled his old claim notes and found a photo of the Vale house from that earlier visit. In the photo, the back window had bars that were not in the neighborhood norm. The report also mentioned smoke detectors missing, which could be another control tactic. Reeve realized Kester might have recognized him, then used the storm chaos to create leverage. The flood zone was not just danger, it was cover for a staged crisis. Reeve brought that information to detectives, along with his notebook and the official run sheet. He admitted he altered the chart, and he explained why he thought it mattered for safety. He said he feared the supervisor would bury the locked room detail, and he was partly right. Detectives requested the ambulance dash audio, and the unedited file included his spoken notes. That audio captured the bruising observation clearly, and it matched the timestamps. When the county finally released the raw radio file under legal pressure, the gap was obvious. Experts later said it looked like a manual edit, not a transmission drop. The supervisor was placed on leave, then later resigned before a formal hearing concluded. No one publicly called it a cover-up, but the paperwork language was careful and pointed. Reeve was disciplined for the protocol breach, but he kept his license after review. Kester was charged in a separate case, based on Marlon's statements and corroborating evidence. The storm did not cause the bruises, and it did not install a chain lock on a bedroom. Reeves' choice to enter the water was still a violation, and he accepted that fact. But his larger break from protocol was quieter, the choice to keep notes beyond the system. Those notes helped unwind what the storm tried to hide. Months later, Reeve returned to that same river road on a dry afternoon. The Vale house looked smaller in daylight, and the porch rail had been replaced. Reeve did not go up to the door, and he did not need to. He sat in his truck for a minute, then drove away, thinking about rules and reality. In the end, the storm was loud, but the real danger was the silence people edited in.